Welcome everyone to our Lunch and Learn version of Joe Talks, where we are still looking this year as a reminder, we're looking at how our financial system is plagued with racism and how we can work to change that. So earlier this spring, we heard about the living wage and the need to raise wages for workers, and today we're going to learn about the wealth gap from Mr. Ray Boshara, who works at the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. So without further ado, I'll let Sister Kate Reagan start us off with the opening prayer.
We are gathered today to see with new eyes and a heart in our hearts, to look at the racial wealth gap in the United States. May we be open to the Spirit, that we not only hear the words of our presenter, Ray Boshara, but we can change this wrong in the United States. May the Spirit of truth and justice guide us as we listen to this presentation. Amen. And now, Associate Cheryl Archibald will introduce our speaker.
Ray, Senior Advisor for the Institute of Economic Equity at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. He is also a Senior Fellow in the Financial Security Program at the Aspen Institute. Before joining the Federal Reserve in 2011, Boshara was Vice President of New America, a think tank in Washington, D.C., where he launched and directed the asset building, financial inclusion, and the next social contract policy programs. He also serves as policy director at Prosperity Now and on the domestic policy staff of the U.S. House Senate Select Committee, on hunger. I like to call him Mr. Ray. Is widely accredited with leading the campaign to enact the Assets for Independent Acts, which created thousands of individual development accounts. He is also behind baby bonds, Roths at birth, and other bills in the U.S. Congress to establish saving accounts for all kids. Over the past 25 years, he has advised presidential candidates as well as George W. Bush, Clinton, Obama, and Trump administrations. He has testified before the U.S. House and Senate several times, and he has written for the Washington Post, the New York Times, Atlanta, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, among others. His book, The Next Progressive Era, co-authored with Philip Longman, was published in 2009. He was raised in Ohio, a graduate of Ohio State University, Yale Divinity School, and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Long list, Ray. You are one of us, a Catholic, I know, for the Federal Reserve. I've heard you several times, and it's always something new and fresh and something surprising. So we welcome you. Thank you for being with us. And may I remind our participants to type your name in the chat area or your questions if you have anything that you would like for Ray to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl, for the warm and kind introduction. I know we've been talking for about a year now. It's great to see the event come together. Also, real profound thanks to Sisters Claire and Kate and the other sisters and staff of the Sisters St. Joseph of Carondelet. Marie Kenyon's on the phone. Many of you know she directs our Peace and Justice Commission, and I had the honor of serving with her on that. And we were just saying the other day what huge fans we are of the Sisters of St. Joseph. And so it's a real honor to be here today. And as Marie knows, and some of you others know, I love doing these kinds of talks because it brings my work and my faith together. And so I, being Catholic and working on wealth inequality at the CFED is it's nice when these opportunities come together. So I really do appreciate the opportunity. And I just would close by saying it was a nun in divinity school who changed my life. Sister Margaret Farley, some of you might know of her. And she was my advisor and just pointed a way in faith that hadn't really occurred to me at the time in my search. So I really give Sister Farley a lot of credit for my own life in many ways. So as Sister Claire knows, because she works at the Fed too, I have to say that these are my own views, not necessarily those of the Fed. And certainly when I talk about the Catholic faith, I'm definitely not speaking on behalf of the Fed. So I'm going to try to mostly bring the data here from the Fed, but say a little bit about what the church has said about racism. So I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about why are we studying the racial wealth gap, why wealth, and talk a little bit about how Catholics might think about it. And then I'll turn on my slides and give you some of the data, and then I'll turn them off and talk a little bit about how we can respond, both as Americans and as Catholics, to the racial wealth gap. And I know we have some Q&A and discussion to look forward to as well. So let me just start with, of all the things that we can be studying around race, income, education, wages, criminal justice, what is it that's unique and important about the racial wealth gap? And just to be clear, when we talk about wealth, we're talking about your savings, your assets, minus all your debts, your net worth. So your home, your retirement account, any money you have in the bank or the stock market, and you subtract out your debts, and that equals your net worth. So that's wealth, and usually the measure we use is net worth, which is as I mentioned, all your savings less all your debts. And so anyway, that's really, we're talking about wealth, and of course income and education, a whole range of things determine your wealth, but the wealth measure is really unique, and it's really unique for three reasons. One is that there's an economic argument that if you have wealth, you have savings and assets, you have a buffer, something to fall back on should you hit hard times, but you also have a springboard to opportunity. You can make investments in your future and your family and your education, in a small business, bequeathing something to your kids that you can't just do with an income. So there's a really important economic argument there. And many of you might be surprised that when Michael Sheridan of WashU first said, poor people need assets too, not just income, people thought he was nuts. They said, well, if you're poor, you can't accumulate wealth. That's why you're poor. And he completely changed that discussion and said that this has to be an important part of how we think about combating poverty and combating racism, is to make sure that poor people also have a chance to build savings and wealth. So that's the first argument. The second argument is that it's kind of a psychological civic argument, which is that when you own things, you treat them better and different than you would if you just rented things. So, you think about the home you own or a car you own versus those that you rent, and how you take great pride in those things. You take care of them. You want them to last. And it turns out that when you hold wealth, it gets you to think about the future in ways that you might otherwise not. There's a scholar, Willie Elliott at University of Michigan, who has come up with this term, the college-bound identity. And what he's found is that even very low income kids who only have $50 or $100 in a savings account, a college savings account in their name, are far more likely to go and to finish college than they were if they didn't have those accounts, because the account embodies hope, an investment in the future, and makes them think that they are going to college. They have a college-bound identity, and it changes the way they think about their school and about saving and financial empowerment. So there's a lot of these asset effects that are really important that you don't just get with income. And then the third reason that we study wealth is kind of a public policy argument. And this is particularly important when we're talking about the racial wealth gap, because the US government for 400 years has been in the business of deciding who gets to own property and who does not. Now, of course, we started off with white men who owned property, were the only ones who could vote and participate in our democracy. We've gradually expanded that, of course, to eventually include women and non-property owners, and eventually, of course, to Blacks. But there was a huge cost to excluding women and Blacks, and of course, taking land from Native American people so that we could grant this land to largely white people over many years. So, you know, the important thing with the racial wealth gap is that it was intentional government choices to exclude Black Americans from the opportunity to accumulate wealth, okay, over many years, right up actually until very recently. So you think about the Homestead Act, right? 160 acres, worked it for 5 years. You got to keep that property and it stayed in your family. 1/4 of all Americans today, white Americans, can trace their legacy of property ownership to the Homestead Act. Then you had the GI Bill, which also excluded people of color. You had Social Security, which excluded professions that largely employed people of color. So they didn't get in on that when it was created in the 1930s. And then, of course, there were redlining, what they call redlining in homeownership policies throughout the 20th century, where basically government staff and bankers drew lines, red lines around areas that were considered too high risk, which were largely people of color. And they didn't get loans, couldn't access credit, couldn't buy homes, and couldn't build wealth through homeownership, right? Now, so there's been all these opportunities, and then there were the promises that were not delivered, like 40 acres and a mule. And so the cost of all these policies over time is really staggering. One scholar determined that if we had in fact followed through on the promise of 40 acres and a mule following the Civil War, the typical Black family in America would have $840,000 more in wealth today, than they have, right? $840,000 per family had we had the cumulative effect of starting with 40 acres and a mule and not had discrimination ever since then. And that's basically the difference that's the racial wealth gap in terms of averages. And so it's a powerful number. And then many of you, last week were tuned into the commemoration of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And, just so many stories there. But John Rogers, who heads up Aerial Investments, an African-American, he noted that his great-grandfather, J.B. Stratford, had a $125,000 hotel at the time, which today, had it not been destroyed in the race riots, would be worth $100 million today. So think about all that lost generational wealth because his property was literally destroyed, okay? So the point here is that the racial wealth gap is very intentional. It's the result of many years of policies. It actually continues today because things like the tax code and student loans make the racial wealth gap worse. There's still biases in homeownership policies and hiring practices. So it's not like it's gone away because legally it's gone away. It's still very much a part of our lives. But the racial wealth gap itself, whether you look at the median balance, which I'll talk about in a minute, or the average, which I just gave you, is really large because wealth begets wealth. If you never have an opportunity to accumulate it, either from the government and or from your family, you just can't build it. So not having wealth perpetuates itself, just like having wealth perpetuates itself. All right. So the scholars who study the racial wealth gap say that unless we make progress on closing the racial wealth gap, we're not really making racial progress, because the gap is sort of, the wealth is sort of like the best barometer of our overall progress on closing other forms of racial inequity. And I'll show you a few numbers on that just in a few moments. And finally, I think many of you have read the 2018 Pastoral Letter, Open Wides Our Heart from the bishops, where they're very clear that there has been systematic denial of wealth building opportunities, Jim Crow laws and customs, and there's a real call as Catholics to confront that, be honest about it, and and to overcome it. So that's a little bit of an introduction. I'm going to go through some slides here fairly quickly, just to give you a sense of what the numbers look like. So let's see here. Hopefully I can do this correctly. Hang on. There we are. Share. Okay. Can you all see that? Yeah, great.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we can.
So I thought I would start with what does the overall distribution of wealth inequality look like in the United States? And this is the most recent data we have, which is 2019, which does not reflect COVID. The data don't go through COVID just yet, the wealth data. And the bottom line here is that you have, a highly, wealth inequality is massive. It's much larger than income inequality. And as you can see on the far left there, top 10% of families own 76% of the nation's wealth. Okay, and that's up from 67% 30 years ago. The next 40%, they have just 22% of the nation's wealth, and that's down from 30% a generation ago. And then that tiny little sliver there, not drawn to scale, is the whole entire bottom half of the population. They only have 1% of the nation's wealth, and that's actually down from 3% 30 years ago. So the only people that have grown their wealth in the last generation has been the top 10%. Okay, so we have a really, really large wealth inequality problem itself, all right, in the United States. Now, if you take the entire bottom 50% of the wealth distribution, okay, if you just look at the bottom half of you take that $96 trillion and look at the bottom half, who makes up that? And as you can see, the Blacks are the overwhelming majority of the people who make up the bottom half of the wealth distribution. So 75% of Blacks, 67% of Hispanics, and 41% of whites make up are part of the bottom 50% of the wealth distribution. So Blacks are overrepresented in the bottom half of the wealth distribution as well. Now, I'm sorry, this is might seem like a kind of complicated chart, but this is showing you the trends between Black and white wealth since 1989 right up until today. All right, so there's just a few key points I want to show you. If you start on the far left, you can see that whites had about $143,000 in median net worth compared to $9,000 for Blacks. Median net worth means halfway in the distribution. So half of white Americans had above 143 in net worth and half had below. And similarly with 9,000, half had above and half had below. Now, so one way to put this, make this a little bit more real, one way of saying this, to illustrate this gap here, is to say that Blacks had about 6 cents of wealth for every dollar held by whites. So if you just divide 9 into 143, you get 6. Okay. Now, if you move over to 2007, that number actually, got better for Blacks. Blacks had 12 cents of wealth for every $1 held by whites. You then move to 2016, it goes back down to 10 cents on the dollar. Okay, and then you go to today, Blacks have about 12 cents on the dollar for every $1 held by whites. So we're making progress. We've gone from 6 cents on the dollar to 12 cents on the dollar, but I would emphasize that we're still talking about, very small fractions of wealth compared to whites. Whether it's 6 cents or 12 cents, it's a very, very small amount of wealth compared to whites. And as you can see, the gap hasn't really changed significantly over many years. And that's very troubling because we've had all kinds of other progress in those 30 years. Voting rights, educational attainment has been really remarkable among Blacks. Political representation, the banning of legal discrimination, but it's not really changing that racial wealth gap number that I told you about. And so that's the real problem that policymakers are struggling with. Why is other progress not translating into more wealth? And that's a key issue that many people, scholars and academics and policymakers are working on. And it's just the final thing I'd point out about this graph here is that we can focus on this gap, which, as I said, is about 12 cents on the dollar for Blacks compared to whites, the absolute differences in their wealth. Imagine what you could do if you had $4,000 of net worth compared to having only $23,000. Think about college, think about retirement, thinking about starting a business, thinking about the resilience you would have if you lose your job or there's a hurricane or something like that. This absolute level of wealth really matters. And I think the key point here is that we can spend a lot of time worrying about whether the gap is up or the gap is down. But the real thing to focus on is how much wealth do Black and other low wealth families have to live their lives. And so I think the bigger challenge is, it'd be great to reduce the gap, but the more important challenge is to build wealth up from the bottom. And we'll talk a little bit about ways to do that later in the presentation. Okay, so those are kind of the overall numbers and some of the trends. And next thing I just want to show you is why is wealth not translating, why is progress not translating into more wealth? And I just want to look at education here to illustrate one of the challenges that we have in translating other gains into more wealth. And the first one here, the main one I want to show you is education. Now, many believe that education is the great equalizer. And as you know, many foundations and policymakers spend a lot of time trying to get more low income and minority kids to college, thinking that's their ticket. Well, it is true that if you have more education, you have more wealth and you have more income. That's great. That's how it should be. But the problem is that, and as this graph shows, that as education increases, the wealth gap actually gets bigger, not smaller. So in other words, if you just look at this high school, the second one over there, high school, the whites have about 115,000 in net worth compared to 14 for Blacks. That's a gap of $114,000 between Blacks and whites with high school degrees. If you move over to the bachelor's level, the gap between 298 and 51 is 247. And then if you compare the wealth of people with postgraduate or professional degrees, the gap is $482,000. So whites have whites with a graduate or professional degree have about $597,000 in net worth compared to 115. So again, the key point here is that wealth does grow with education, but the gap gets much, much bigger as education level rises. So ironically and disturbingly, the racial wealth, education is an engine of the racial wealth gap, not the great equalizer. Okay, and that's one of the reasons we're having a hard time closing this gap despite other progress, because whites are getting much higher returns on the assets that they invest in. So whether it's a home or an education or a business, whites tend to get far greater returns on those assets than Blacks do. And if you want to talk about some of the reasons behind that, such as like student loans and mortgage practices, we can do that. But the bottom line here is that there's, this myth of education being an equalizer, while it is very important for those who are capable and willing, is not going to close the gap. It's actually making it worse. Okay. What I wanted to show you here is just to point out that on every single measure at the Fed that we could come up with to measure the Black-white wealth gap, Blacks come out behind. That doesn't surprise you, but I just want to show you some numbers. We've already gone over the differences in median net worth, 184 for white families, 23 for Black. But home ownership rates, 45% for Black families, 73% for whites. And keep in mind that Blacks get far lower returns on the homes when they do own them than whites do. And then if you did a survey on how long could a family live if they just had to live on their liquid savings, on their rainy day fund, whites could go 31 days, Blacks could only make it 5. And how many are underwater? They have negative net worth. Their debts are greater than their assets. 8 in 100 white families compared to 18 in 100 Black families. And how many white versus Black families have already become millionaires? 15 in 100 white families are already millionaires compared to just 2 in 100 for Black families. Okay. So I just have one more slide here before we talk about sort of policy recs and how we move forward. And here I just wanted to bring it home a little bit and talk about what some of these gaps look like in the St. Louis area. Wealth data is a lot harder to get at the local level, so we don't have a lot of really good wealth data. The data that we have seen that is not generated by the Fed suggests that the gaps at the local level are very similar to the gaps at the national level. But I wanted to share with you this slide that the folks at WashU put together. It was first called For the Sake of All. It's now called Health Equity Works. And they basically took 2 zip codes and just showed the differences in numbers. So 63105 in Clayton versus 63106 in North St. Louis. Look at the difference in life expectancy, 67 years versus 85 years. That is a remarkable difference in life expectancy between Black and white residents who are separated by just a few miles. Now, the racial makeup, not surprisingly, in Clayton, it's 78% white compared to 95% African American in North St. Louis. The unemployment rate in Clayton is only 4% compared to 24% in North St. Louis. How many live below the poverty line? Only 7% in Clayton compared to 54% in North St. Louis. And then the median household income in Clayton is $90,000, which is way above the national average, but only 15 for North St. Louis, way below the national median. So I just want you to see, if you have an unemployment rate of 24% and 54% below the poverty line and a median household income of only 15, it is really hard to save and build wealth and have financial security. These neighborhood contexts matter enormously. So part of how we do something about the racial wealth gap is to make these communities stronger, right? That's a really important part of the work that many of you are doing beyond housing, a lot of the universities in town, so many good nonprofits, they're all doing the work of trying to make St. Louis a better place. And I think this work is really important. It will help families build wealth, but it's better for everybody if they do. So I'm going to turn off my camera here and just talk a little bit about how we think about public policy going forward, and then just close with a few thoughts on sort of how Catholics think about wealth and wealth inequality and property ownership. And I think from a public policy perspective, the things that the think tanks and the nonprofits and the Congress and Biden administration, the things that they're all worried about, how do they think about trying to close the racial wealth gap? And I think you can put the work into 3 distinct buckets. The first bucket is looking back. Like, what do you do about 400 years of denying people of color the opportunity to build wealth? The Fed doesn't have a position on reparations. It's not really our thing to consider that. But that is what is being proposed by many, of course, some form of significant economic redress to do something about that substantial racial wealth gap that won't go away. Okay, it's embedded, it's historical, it's structural. And so what do you do to sort of close the structural gap? And so that's where some people are talking about a major form of economic redress. The second category is sort of what do you do on an ongoing basis to make the gap sort of work, to reduce the gap. And, this is where you're looking like and I'm not making an endorsement here, but the Biden administration has made a very concerted effort to increase home ownership and small business ownership, to do more contracting with people of color. When they talk about the American Rescue Jobs and Families plans, they have a very strong racial equity lens. So, there's that. And then there are many groups working just to help people build up their rainy day funds. Turns out that the research shows that simply having a cash buffer really goes a long way in helping families from falling further behind and helping them move forward. The tax code inadvertently is actually making the racial wealth gap worse, not by design. It's simply that, the way the tax code works is that if the more wealth and savings you have, like for retirement or in a home, the bigger the tax break you get. And it turns out, of course, that most wealthy people are white, so they're getting bigger subsidies to build wealth for retirement and home ownership than are people of color. Student loans are negatively and disproportionately affecting people of color. You can reform those. And then there's a whole range of things you can do on retirement savings and small businesses and first-time home ownership and home valuations and assessments. There's a whole agenda there. And then the final thing policymakers are thinking about are, how do we look ahead? You know, this is where things like baby bonds come in. Every kid born in America or every kid born in a state gets a college savings account or some sort of a wealth account at birth, so they can later on buy a home and go to college and start a business and save for retirement. When I was in Congress, I worked on many of these bills. Today, the efforts really do focus at the state level. Already 7 states around the country set up a 529 college savings account at birth for each one of their kids. And research shows that they are having a particularly strong impact on people of color and improving maternal and child mental and health outcomes as well. So these are promising. There's an effort in Missouri to create a 529 account at birth. It got pretty far in the state legislature. It didn't quite make it. So we're hoping that something could happen next year. And this is something that the Archdiocese is very supportive of. So, and then, you know, finally, I would just say overall kind of improving early childhood environments, whether it's education, music, nutrition, assets. You know, the research shows that that's where you make the biggest difference in closing the gaps down the road. Is what happens earlier in life really gets magnified negatively or positively. So that's important. And then just the last thing I'll say is, you know, Catholics, how do we think about wealth inequality? And the important thing is to note that Pope Francis, like every pope before him, has affirmed the right to private property. Owning property in itself is not the problem. The problem is the concentration of wealth prevents wealth from being shared more broadly. You know, there's something that Pope John Paul II said in one of his encyclicals, that private property has a social mortgage. You know, that you have to limit the use of private property because it was created by God for the benefit of all human beings. So extreme wealth inequality undermines the social role of property that the church feels is very important. Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti says that we really need to be good Samaritans to help our neighbors. That's the central message, I think, of Fratelli Tutti. But he also says, you know, we have to think about the structural causes of poverty and inequality as well, and work on land reform and property rights and organizing, you know, the kinds of things that I know the sisters support and Catholic Campaign for Human Development support as well. So, you know, I think there's a moral obligation as Catholics to do something about wealth inequality and certainly to do something about the racial wealth gap. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ray, for this very informative and eye-opening talk. Are there any questions for Ray right now? And if so, please type your name in the chat. Or if you can't find the chat box, I can be looking for you if you're waving your hand, and I will call on you. Otherwise, I will. Oh, all right. Cheryl has our first question.
Mm-hmm. Real quick, Ray, when you were talking about the educational piece, you said that it's actually making things worse. Can you elaborate on that a little?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you, Cheryl. So you know, education is both making it better and worse. So if you do actually go to college and finish college, you're more likely to have more wealth than somebody who does not. Okay. Overall, in general, no matter whether you're white, black, or Hispanic, you know, the more education you have, the more wealth you have. So that's the good news. The bad news is that whites gain far more on their investment in education than blacks do. And that gap gets worse the higher up you go. So a white with a college degree gets a much bigger return on their investment than a black with a college degree. And it even gets worse when you compare at the graduate school level. Now, student loans are a big part of the problem here. And this is what I didn't get a chance to elaborate on. So blacks are far more likely to have a student loan, far more likely to have a bigger student loan, and far more likely to default on the loans that they have. So And the problem with student loans is that they displace other forms of building wealth, which is why they have such a strong negative impact on the balance sheet. So when you're making a student loan payment, what are you not doing? Not saving for retirement, not opening that small business, right? Not making, not buying that first home, not passing wealth on to your kids, not having a buffer. So it really displaces a lot of wealth. One study even shows that every dollar you have in student loans takes away $7 out of your wealth. So it's a big factor. But there's other reasons too that the returns aren't the same. Unfortunately, fewer people of color get on the STEM tracks, science, math, and engineering, technology, simply because they don't have the same academic preparation as their white peers.
All right. Ray, Lori Fick is asking, how does the tax code impact Blacks and people of color?
Well, here's the thing about the tax code. It does two things. It redistributes income and it redistributes wealth. So if you have a pretty high income, you pay a bigger percentage of your income than somebody who has a lower income. And that's good. That's the progressive side of taxation. But when it comes to wealth, it's actually the opposite. The tax code is actually regressive. So you get a tax break based on how much you save for retirement or how big your mortgage is, right? The problem is that the bigger your mortgage, the larger your retirement contribution. I mean, that means you just get a bigger break. So wealthier people who can afford bigger mortgages and to save more for retirement actually get a bigger tax break. Okay, so already you have overall wealth inequality increasing because of the tax code. But then because white people are far more likely to be wealthy than Black people, they benefit more from those tax breaks. And, Blacks are far less likely to own a home in the first place or to have a retirement account, so they don't even get the tax breaks to begin with. They're more likely to rent or count on Social Security. So inadvertently, and not by design, but inadvertently, the tax code is actually making the racial wealth gap worse. There's a new book on this topic by Dorothy Brown at Emory. And it's really a remarkable book. And she opened up a lot of people's eyes to how something that we thought was neutral, in fact, is not.
And Therese Sherlock is asking, how has the child wealth account worked in the states that have done it?
It's worked very well. So about 7 states have done it. The most rigorously tested is in the state of Oklahoma. Interestingly, a conservative state has set up accounts, $1,000 at birth for like 1,300 kids. And they literally compared that to 1,300 kids who did not get the account. So a true experiment. And the kids, and even though they set up these accounts in $1,000 back in 2007, despite the Great Recession and now COVID, these accounts are worth a lot more money. So they've been invested really well. So I think one of the benefits of these accounts is that kids become investors too. So much of the growth and wealth happens in the stock market, less so in home ownership. And as I mentioned earlier, when they've done experimental research, mothers have higher expectations for their kids. They have lower mental health, and the kids see a brighter future for themselves as well. And kids who have these accounts set up by the state are far more likely to set up their own accounts and start saving for themselves as well. So we're really excited about the 7 states that are doing that already. And I think many more states are going to do it in the future. Hopefully Missouri is one of them.
Yeah, that is exciting. And St. Louis City has started that. So that's a good thing.
Yes, I should have mentioned. So those are the statewide examples beyond housing here in St. Louis, the city of St. Louis, United Way at one point, the Scholarship Foundation of St. Louis at one point. They've all done their own programs, and they're overall doing really well. Some of them don't exist anymore, but the ones that are still with us are doing pretty well.
Yeah. And I think what you're also pointing out is the need for reparations, because as the economy, as we're all participating in the economy, the gap is going to increase because we're all white people have more resources and access, and we and that could be a good way to equal this out. Is that what you're thinking?
Could you state the question again, sister? I'm sorry.
Oh, I was saying the case for reparations is needed because this gap is not going to close, because white people are going to continue to.
I mean, I can't agree with that working at the Fed, but I can tell you the scholars who've written about this, like William Darity and his wife, Kirsten Mullen, that's exactly the argument that they make, that unless you do, you're not going to close it, even if you do student loan reform, tax code reform, and baby bonds, and all those things, and get home ownership right, you're not going to make a big dent, they argue, in the wealth gap overall until you do something about all the past injustices that prevented people of color from accumulating wealth in the first place. So that is their argument, yes.
And then what is the name of Dorothy Brown's book on the tax code reform? But you can get
The Whiteness of Wealth.
Oh. Okay. Now we will head into our small group discussion. And Ray has come up with a couple of questions for us to discuss. Whenever you go into and the questions will also be put in the chat, which you should be able to see in your small group. But you can also, so Ray's going to ask that. And then when you're automatically going to be put into a small group. Unmute yourself. You have to unmute yourself when you're in there. And then at the end of 20 minutes, everybody will have 20 minutes to discuss. You will be brought back into this large room here. So without further ado, the questions.
Okay. So let me just put the questions up. Hang on. Okay. So first one is, what promotes trust with people and communities that are different from and less advantaged than us? Must we build trust before trying to make a difference in their lives? The second question is, this has to do with my comment earlier, that many research reports show that early in life investments, nutrition, education, music, language, assets can have the biggest impact on closing opportunity gaps. What are some things that you and your community could do to help Black, low income, and other disadvantaged persons and communities early in life? I forgot to put that part on there. And then finally, if you had 5 minutes with a governor, president, or vice president, what would you encourage him or her to do to promote racial equity?
All right, welcome back to the large room. I hope you had good discussions in your small groups. And now I invite you to share anything with, if you have any other questions for Ray or any comments that you all talked about in your small groups that you feel would be good to share with the large group. Please type your name in the chat and I will call on you so that we can have a large group discussion around the questions. Or you can raise your hand and I'm kind of looking out here. Oh, Ross. Okay, Ross, would you share?
Unmute. Okay.
So I'm Ross's wife, Linda. So one of the questions was, what can our Missouri governor do to help things like this? And I said he does not want to fund Medicaid expansion, which was approved by 53% of the voters. And the other thing we talked about, another thing we talked about was a program in Missouri is Parents as First Teachers, which you can Google. And the Parent as First Teacher educator comes to the house from the time the child is an infant monthly until they're like 3 or 4, and help parents know how to teach the kids things, and also I imagine to assess how the child is doing to catch problems at an early age.
Yeah. That is a good organization. Mhm. The earlier, like Ray was saying, the earlier we can start, the better. Who else would like to share something from their small group discussion?
Well, Claire, I'll just say, I think a number of us in my group were taken by that idea of baby bonds and the huge impact that could have on not only the child, but the family. That just seems like a real win-win situation. We also talked about forgiveness or some kind of diminishment of those student loans would also be a great help in trying to come a little bit closer to equalizing that wealth gap.
Cheryl?
Okay, a few things from my group. One, for sure, raising the minimum wage to something that's a livable wage should be a priority that we would put out to our politicians. We agree that if we were younger, we probably could do more things to be a part of communities that need assistance, and definitely participate in intervention for early childhood. But being that I'm older, I'll say I'm a senior, everyone else is younger than I am, to make sure that we get out and vote and elect people who put people first. There's a lot of distrust of information out here. And so it's important that we need to be attentive to who we're putting in office. They should represent the will of the people, and they should be people that we trust. So those are going to be crucial because they impact our laws and things that happen.
Yes. Ida, unmute. You can unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, Ida.
I think the action that Biden took in going immediately to down to Oklahoma to Tulsa after that broadcast gave us a little bit of hope that maybe, just maybe, some repayment for something that that the Black community lost may be restored. There's so much racism in our country. That's a big hope, but perhaps his conscience can animate the conscience of many, many more people.
Yeah, right. Having the president recognize that was a big step. Linda?
I just wanted to comment on Cheryl's comment about minimum wage. And I went to Target this morning and I was surprised to see on the door that they start at $15 an hour. And also, I think an important thing is to pass that Voting Rights Act.
Oh, that's good. That's good for Target employees. Yeah. Yeah, and the Voting Rights Act is important. Mm-hmm. Ray, I didn't know since you had asked the question, but if you can answer it, what would you say what should we say to our legislators or president or vice president or governor about this issue?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think most people would resist picking one thing because no one thing alone is going to close the racial wealth gap. No, I don't know. I do love the idea of the baby bonds is kind of close to my heart. I've been working on it for 20 years. And you can do the same thing for retirement, you can start a retirement account at birth, a college account. And one of the benefits of that is that it gets low income and minority Americans invested in the stock market, and, it used to be that home ownership was the kind of the predictable way to build wealth, but the stock market has been performing much better. So I'm a big fan of getting kids into investment accounts early in life, and being a part of that. A lot of the racial wealth gap, the variation isn't so much because of what's changing on the bottom, it's because of all the fluctuation on the top. So if the stock market's doing well, the racial wealth gap gets much bigger, but that doesn't improve anybody's life on the low end, So I would also say focus on those efforts that build wealth from the bottom, more so than the ones that worry too much about whether the gap is up or down, even though the gap is an important barometer. But the student loan thing is critical. And then I would just say one of the reasons we have a student loan crisis, especially for low income, first generation people of color, is because too many of them are pushed into the college path without alternatives. And so there's a real effort to create better alternatives for kids for whom college is not their path. The student loan rate for dropouts is so high, and we got to create other paths for kids besides college, because it's just not for everybody.
Yeah. All right, and our last comment or question, Mary, first.
I really liked the baby bonds idea. I had not heard of that before. And I just wanted to add, I love the idea of helping them see themselves as having a future, a bright future. And if the group decides to do something, one thing they did in our school district was they went through and they took out any books that they felt were depicting any persons of color in poor ways, inaccurate ways. And then they stocked up on all sorts of books depicting children and adults of different cultures, a lot of diversity, where they are the agents in the story, where they are the heroes, the true stories and fiction as well. Many are created and sold by persons of color as well. So I just want to put that in there, that the arts, it's always important to couple anything having to do with finance or anything else with the arts that really touch the heart. And so just wanted to throw that extra tidbit in there.
Thank you, Mary. All right, well, great, yes.
Well, I was just going to mention one idea that happens in some communities is Catholic or faith communities, is this adoption of a sister community, like Catholics often do with a church in Guatemala or Nicaragua. You can do the same thing with a poor community here and set up the college savings accounts for all the kids in that community. I mean, there's nothing preventing those kinds of things happening here as well. So, we've talked about that within the Peace and Justice Commission, and maybe something the church would encourage.
Yeah. Well, we have a lot of action to think about and to start taking. And I want to thank you, Ray, for spending your time with us this afternoon and sharing all this information so that we can all do this work of faith and hope together. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but this is put on by our Racial and Cultural Justice Committee. And I would like to thank all the members of our committee for continuing this series. Our next series, the last of this year, will be in the fall. It's forthcoming, the date and the topic, but it will still fall under the financial system. And thank you all for joining us today. And there will be email or news forthcoming on continued actions. So have a good rest of the day.
Thank you all so much for your time. I really enjoyed it too. Thank you.
Thank you.